I talk with UCLA professor and author Ramesh Srinivasan. He has a new book out entitled Whose Global Village, about the information revolution and how it's being kneecapped by the powerful algorithms that Facebook and Google use to decide what news to show us. We are waking up as a culture, but a lot of that can easily be sidelined by a couple of massive internet companies. Ramesh, thank you for joining me here. How powerful are Google and Facebook?
Data is like the oil of our world today.
Right.
Like data is the oil of the new economy. And there's two companies that not only dominate people's internet and social media experiences, but they also own and control so much data about us as their users. You're talking 1.8 billion approximately users around the world of these platforms. You can see these platforms buying lots of other technologies, like WhatsApp, for example, which was supposed to be like a privacy encryption, peer-to-peer text messaging platform, is now owned by Facebook. It's actually, they're incredibly powerful because of what they own and what they control.
And now Facebook is a bit of a tangent here, looking to connect a lot more of the world using their adding the internet and stuff, but really those people will only be connected to a Facebook and a few partner sites.
Right.
So it's not like connecting them to the full internet.
Yeah. It's the opposite of net neutrality. And they actually use the term, which is to me incredibly patronizing, the last billion. It's as if everybody, these people are disenfranchised and they have to be connected. But what internet are they getting connected to? They're connecting to an internet that serves the agendas of these companies. It's actually super surreal, the moment that we're in right now, because companies like Facebook and Google are almost like their own nation states in a way. When the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, came to India, he was an incredibly powerful political leader. He came on one of his visits and came and visited Facebook's headquarters before he met Obama.
Facebook was more important than Obama.
Seemingly, right?
So now let's get into confirmation bias. I think it's having an incredible impact on our world.
It's basically how is information being selected for us to view, both in our search results as well as on our news feeds on Facebook, or even on the stream on Twitter, for example. Generally speaking, we know that it tends to confirm our existing biases. What does that mean? So like I have certain perspectives, there's certain choices or preferences I have. Information is semantically analyzed, and then it's brought to us based on its similarities with the content that we've already put out or our already existing preferences based on what we liked or whatever. But it's also biased because of who our friends are.
Right.
And we're all different, of course, in lots of ways, but it's very difficult, as we all know, online to interact with people who have very different political perspectives than your own, let alone have them be your Facebook friends who you share baby pictures with or cat videos with, maybe.
And it's gotten so advanced how they decide who we are and what we like that things that you wouldn't think say anything about you actually can say a lot about you. You know, like they found out that it showed you were likely to have a higher IQ if you liked this page on curly fries. And it was because that, just by coincidence or whatever, that page had gotten out through an intelligent community. So if you like that page, and you don't think when I like a page on curly fries, I'm telling them something about myself deep.
It must be the geometry of the curly fries.
Right? You're really into that. But so speaking of that,
spiral.
Speaking of all this information, talk a little bit about Cambridge Analytica. And I did a piece on Robert Mercer and how he's one of the big funders of Cambridge Analytica. And that data mining company likely was pivotal in both the Trump vote and the Brexit vote.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly how central it was, but we do know that Ted Cruz's campaign, which was like the first that Mercer was working with, and Steve Bannon's on Cambridge Analytica's board, we all know Steve Bannon, where the Cruz campaign wasn't getting a lot of popular support in early polls. And we do know that, of course, Cruz ended up being like the finalist for the Republican nomination.
Right.
So we don't know if that's because of Analytica or not, but let me just talk a little bit about them. This is about the big data revolution, if you will, that's occurring. When all our data is open for sale, we're not just talking about the data we put out on Facebook and Google and other platforms, but just random stuff. Like I go to a grocery store and I buy something. That can be bought and sold through data brokers.
Right.
When you can purchase a lot of data and you can also compare and aggregate that data with data that we're putting out online, including on those platforms, you can develop incredibly sophisticated, though sometimes incorrect, models of understanding one's potential psychological behavior. a psychometric behavior is what we call it. And then you can feed people content, including supposed news stories that actually can influence implicitly their political inclinations. It might make you disinterested in voting. It might make you more interested in voting for someone than someone else. It might change your idea on a certain type of political movement or a political campaign. So we know that Cambridge Analytica has bragged about having about 5,000 data points on 220 million Americans.
That's crazy.
So that's a lot, because they boast and they say, hey, like, we with a certain number of Facebook likes can actually understand you more so than maybe a family member or maybe a friend. But this is this philosophical problem with all of this, as opposed to what's really politically troubling about this privacy and data issue, is if we become governed by the algorithms that are supposed to model who we are in our behavior, we actually become essentially agents of the algorithm. Like, so the algorithm ends up determining who we end up becoming. The algorithm is supposed to estimate who we are by culling together all this data, and then it actually determines in many ways what our lives are. So this isn't Big Brother, but it's the capture of data, which Americans have made a Faustian contract on. They've decided to give up their data for economic advertising, and now we're a little bit worried to know that this is now influencing political advertising as well.
Yeah, it's both how much data you're putting out there, but then also the influence on you of this information.
Exactly.
I had on a while back during the election, I had on Dr. Robert Epstein, and he's talked a lot about search engine optimization manipulation. The example I like to use was for people that didn't know a lot about voting or politics. They kept hearing about the delegate count. So they look up on Google, what is the delegate count between Hillary and Bernie? Google would immediately show them a bar graph that factored in superdelegates as if they had already been counted. People who didn't know a lot about this, didn't know superdelegates don't vote till later, would have thought, wow, Hillary's killing him. It's just about over.
And our mainstream media did the same thing, right?
Yeah, they did that too.
This is actually a point, and I think part of the reason why this whole fake news hysteria exists is partly because there's a lack of trust in general in the media, and there's also a lack of trust in these platforms implicitly, yet we're so connected to them. This is a huge bombshell that I've been looking at. More Americans go to Facebook to receive news, which might come from other sources, but we know all the problems with it that we were just talking about, then receive their news even on like the New York Times or the Washington Post. And I think part of it is people feel like the social contract they have with media is not necessarily serving their interests, that we know that media are framed to cover certain agendas. But now we've gone to platforms that are even worse in a sense, because they don't have any journalistic integrity or any contract around what they do and why they share what they share.
It's a double-edged sword, because people have learned a lot about certain things that maybe the media doesn't tend to like to cover. Bernie Sanders movement or revolution, whatever you want to call it, never could have happened before the internet, because they gave 23 times as much coverage to Trump during the primaries as Bernie Sanders. People were learning about him online. But the other side of the sword is a lot of people are trusting sites like Breitbart that have no integrity, it seems.
Which was the politically most trafficked news source, which I never saw on my Facebook feed at all. You know?
Yeah, I never see it either, but apparently people are reading it.
At the time of the election. The question is why and how, and it's partly because of the content itself and the kind of hysteria of the content. There have been studies that have shown how, there's some reporting on this that shows certain words are chosen by the Trump team to say because of how viral they may go, like the meme of it, or the clickbait of using certain forms of language on the tweets, right? Lying Ted, corrupt Hillary, little Marco. Well, these are pretty good. They're hilarious, and they just travel. So there's something to the semantics and the structure.
Every title has to have the word destroy in it. Someone destroyed someone. Someone was destroyed. Jon Stewart destroyed so-and-so. So what's the path forward? What gives you hope in dealing with this?
I mean, there's like a few things. I actually think we need almost like it's a loaded term, but like almost like a bill of rights for people in relation to data and media. So there's a few things. One is we need to pressure the heck out of Facebook and Google to not develop simply new systems or new technologies to solve their fake news problem. We need to ask them to be more accountable to us, because even though they are for-profit, privately held companies in the sense that they're stockholders and so on, they are actually the face of American journalism, and they want that because the more that we're on those sites, the more data they have about us. Similarly, just like newspaper industries had to be regulated in the days of William Randolph Hearst, these guys need to have a conversation with us. And there are a few things they can do. They can explain to us why we see what we see. You don't have to give the code. We don't want, maybe we'll be bored looking at the code. They could just explain why we see what we see. They can give us some different options around seeing other kinds of ways of ordering and showing information.
Would you like more global news stories? And you could
Exactly.
click on
If
that,
that's what you want, that's what you can do. Or like you can see different political perspectives around the same issue. They should give us an opportunity to browse outside of our networks. Remember back in the day we talked about surfing and browsing the web? Those things don't happen. Information just comes to you. Or it's like this search thing and we don't even know like what's going on with that. They can give us some options. I also think as Americans, the courts could be potentially important in this data privacy stuff. It's partly like a political literacy, but it's partly like movements, including the courts, that ask for things. Like Americans don't realize, like most Americans don't realize that almost all our data is open for sale. That there are these data brokers.
And Congress just passed something that made it even worse, right, with the ISPs?
Gosh, yes, and so there's the internet service providers, there's the lack of data privacy more generally. There are data brokers like Axion that you can buy and sell data from. And then there's, of course, the fact that the platforms themselves are collecting all this data on us, even when we're not online. Even when we're not on them, there's local software that's being installed. And Edward Snowden's made the point that even when your phone is on airplane mode, data can be collected about you. It's like, how is that happening? Well, it's the local collecting process that's then uploaded to some cloud platform. We need literacy of this. We need to, hopefully the courts can serve us, maybe not the Supreme Court now, but like the lower courts might be able to help us with some of this. And then we need to put pressure, which is exactly what I'm doing with all this media stuff on these companies.
Do you feel we're headed more towards a dystopian future, or like do you have optimism?
I mean, sometimes things have to go really bad for people to wake up and smell the roses here. And the question is, what are the Democrats and the mainstream media going to do? Are they going to actually understand the real reasons why all of this is happening and show some accountability and actually organize with working people who most of this country represent, or not? It's insane. I was just listening to this interview the other day where Chomsky was actually saying on Democracy Now!, he was saying that the majority of Americans, working class and middle class Americans, their mortality rate is increasing. This is the wealthiest country in the world, and most people are dying at younger ages. What's going on here?
Such catastrophic healthcare.
Because of inequality. Right?
Yeah, inequality, and people think stuff is food that's not food. So
Exactly.
We're eating things that are neon orange. Anytime you see that, that's a problem. But yeah, I just did another report on 150 employees at a corporation in Sweden have voluntarily got chips in their hand. And they're like, oh, it's so convenient. I can open the door with my hand and things like that. And you're like, well, that's great, but you do need to have some privacy concerns. Like, where does this go next? Well, we know how your hand's moving. We know what it's doing. We know where you are. We know your health information, like all that.
Yeah, in Silicon Valley, there's this nonsensical narrative that this is a certain new form of cybernetic spirituality. It sounds more like Mad Max to me.
Yeah,
but it's like this is the kind of thing. Did you ever hear about the for example?
No.
I mean, it was kind of a parody, but it was actually, I heard it was being discussed. Who knows? This might be fake news. But like actually literally implanting some sort of sensing in the
There you go.
You know?
Well, I want to know what people's kids are doing. Well, cool. Well, if that is fake news, I'm glad we ended on fake news. So that's a good way to end it. But the book is called Whose Global Village? And thank you so much for making it out here. And keep getting people to realize that we could be in dark times if we're not careful.
Yeah, it's time for us to fight back. There are some things we can do right now about it, like you're doing with your show. So
thank you, Ramesh.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.